Welcome to the Aerospace Ambition podcast. I'm Marius, your host and an engineer passionate about the intersection of sustainable aviation and AI. Please welcome Jo Dardenne from the NGO called Transport and Environment. Jo joined TNE in 2019 after spending 4 years at Grayling Brussels Public Affairs as a public affairs manager, where she led the transport practice. At TNE, she's the aviation director, managing sustainable aviation campaigns to mitigate the impact of this fast-growing source of greenhouse gases. Her work focuses on aviation taxation, the EU emissions trading system, and sustainable fuels. Jo graduated from ISMAP in Paris, where she studied public and political management and communication following 3 years of law studies. Jo, welcome on the show.
Thank you, Marius. Glad to be here.
Nice to have you. And I'd like to start off with a quick personal question. How much do you fly?
How much do I fly? That's a good question. I don't fly that much, to be honest. I'm luckily enough half French, half British. So if I want to see my family, I have rather easy train connections to Great Britain and France. Very long ones as well, but they exist at least.
Well, lucky you, and certainly a good answer given your background. Because you're working for an NGO, a big NGO, that is Transport and Environment, aka TNE. And to set the scene, I'd like to understand, what is TNE? What is its role in especially sustainable aviation?
Sure. TNE, Transport and Environment, is an NGO based in Brussels. So we are a campaigning group trying to influence, raise awareness, and educate policymakers around the rules and measures that need to be put in place to promote sustainable mobility. We have a range of different teams working on a range of different transport modes, ships, cars, trucks, trains, and planes. And on aviation specifically, we try to basically produce different reports, data analysis, scientific reviews to educate policymakers around the different aspects of aviation decarbonizing. We published a roadmap in 2020 around aviation's roadmap to decarbonize by 2050. And that's the way that we operate. We try to provide science-based analysis to inform policymaking, because fundamentally we know that aviation has played and will play a role in our society, in our economy, and that's why we're so eager to encourage policymaking to ensure that that happens in a green way. So we're here to put data out there, inform policymakers, and also the public, the general public, about the, let's say, climate impact, environmental impact of transport and aviation specifically.
Okay, so science-based facts and reports is something which you provide in order to nudge, decision makers into the right direction. We're going to speak about a couple of those publications, and I'm also going to link those in the show notes for those who are interested. But before, I'd like to understand a little bit more the angle of TNE. Money makes the world go round. So how is TNE actually funded?
That's a great question. So we have over 60 members across 24 different countries across Europe. So they are members and pay very small membership fees. That's not how we get the biggest amount of our funding. But they are here to also guide our decision-making process, the positions that we take. They're also the eyes and ears on the ground in different countries. But our current funding is basically through different American and European foundations. So philanthropy, it could be the European Climate Foundation, the Climate Works Foundation, Climate Imperative Foundation. You can find all of our different funders on our website. But yeah, we exist thanks to philanthropy that basically delivers enough budget for us to operate.
Yeah, such an important role in the ecosystem. And speaking about roles, I mean, everyone has his or her own angle to things, and of course your angle or your role is also to criticize where it's necessary, where it's required, and then always to point at the right facts. And I think this nicely leads to this tradition of passing on the question from the previous guest, and our previous guest was Alain Sibert, CTO of 𝐃𝐨𝐧'𝐭. What would it take for TNE to recognize the efforts of 𝐃𝐨 as sufficiently credible to give confidence that the sector is on the right track to decarbonize? What would it take?
What would it take? I'm afraid I'm going to answer to Alain that I don't think we're ready yet or I don't think that we're ready yet to applaud the sector for its efforts. Now, don't get me wrong, we do believe that aviation has a role to play, that that's why we're continuing to highlight why we need aviation to go green. It has a positive impact on society, connectivity. We acknowledge that. We also acknowledge the fact that there's a lot of passionate people working to try and solve this problem. And maybe to reassure him, there are a lot of people within TNE that are also very passionate to solve this problem and find solutions. We have ex-aircraft engineers, ex-airline representatives. We have a lot of people that actually do see the benefit in trying to put in place policies to decarbonize. The issue is that our role is also to push ambition, and this is the whole point of this podcast, is to push ambition where it's most needed. And we need to motivate actors for the right things, the solutions and innovations that will have the biggest impact to decarbonize aviation. And I'm sure we're going to go through a few of these solutions and technologies, but I think within the sector, there are obviously a number of people that are ready to change things, but there are also a huge amount of people that are blocking change, that are lobbying against policies that could help. And this is why we exist. This is what we need to fight against, for the sake of the climate and for the sake of the future aviation industry.
Right. And this could be quantified. I mean, the necessity to decarbonize, and also where we are could be quantified within the roadmaps that are out there. And one of the roadmaps is from 2020, as you said, published by TNE. Now, on a very high level, what kind of growth in air traffic should we expect?
So I think we took different scenarios from the industry, from different roadmaps that existed from the industry, different projections that exist. I think the traditional growth that we've seen over the past couple of years has been quite exponential. Maybe COVID and some changes in behaviors across Europe would tamper slightly that growth, but we still see growth of emissions by probably more than 3% a year from now until 2050. And this is one of the issues that the aviation industry and the policymakers failed to address, which is no one talks about how demand growth, air traffic growth, is actually going to contradict most of aviation's decarbonization targets. Because the more you grow, the more difficult it is to replace your fossil fuel energy with other clean alternatives. And even if you do, you need to produce even more to cover the growth of those emissions. And I think one of the main issues one of the main reasons why these emissions have grown is that there has been a lack of regulation and therefore also a lack of technology uptake for aviation to decarbonize. There has been way too little effort and focus on decarbonization, maybe until COVID, until at least in Europe, the Green Deal was proposed a few years ago. And that's the problem, is that, if you don't regulate, if you don't incentivize, if you don't mandate, a lot of the time, nothing will happen unless, especially in the aviation sector where you have poor competition, let's say, or at least when it comes to aircraft manufacturing or fuel producing, you're basically stuck between a bunch of monopolies. You have a duopoly on one side between Boeing and Airbus, and you have another, let's say, monopoles between different jet fuel suppliers. So that hasn't incentivized, let's say, complete disruptive technologies to actually enter the market. This is why our roadmap was so important, because it's one of the first roadmaps that tried to show what would happen if we continued growing, air traffic as much as we did over the past 30 years, how difficult or more difficult it would be to reach our targets to be net zero by 2050. And not only for the sector as a whole, but also for the technology providers. The more you grow, the more SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, you need to produce, the more energy you'll require to produce those fuels, the more planes you'll need, be it zero emission, hydrogen, electric. So it's also, in the interest of the industry to discuss this, because if you grow too fast without proper technology to decarbonize, you're never going to reach your decarbonization targets.
Yeah, such a difficult point. I mean, how do you balance economic growth and climate goals?
I think there are many ways to address the, let's say, growth angle. I think one of the main things that we've seen over the past years is, aviation is a sector that has been heavily subsidized. COVID is potentially one example of that, but it's not the first one, and definitely not the last one, unfortunately. But during COVID, the airlines in Europe received over 37 billion euros of bailouts, and at a global level, I think we were around 100 billion. So governments have, let's say, subsidized this industry. Airlines have also, benefited from a lot of tax exemptions, which have prompted or artificially prompted the price of tickets being so low. So there basically have been regulatory loopholes that have allowed growth to happen to date. But I do think that there are ways to address this growth challenge. And I think a number of countries in Europe have started thinking about it. And this whole roadmap is about setting the way aviation can decarbonize. And the way that you decarbonize is, first, you reduce as much as you can, you shift as much as you can, and then you decarbonize using the technologies that we hopefully will be able to talk about. And I think some of these issues are addressed in our roadmap, and one of which is linked to corporate travel. We launched 2 years ago the Travel Smart campaign, which is trying to encourage corporate flyers to reduce flying and setting targets to reduce their flying by 50% or more. And we calculated that if corporate flyers actually reduced flying by 50% by 2025, you'd see a 15% drop in aviation emissions by 2030. That represents about 125 million barrels of oil from now until 2050. So in total, we do see that there are parts or segments of the aviation industry that could make faster efforts, that could go faster than other segments, and that could lead the way to try and reduce aviation demand as a whole.
This was when? When did you make this proposal?
So the Travel Smart campaign was launched in 2020. Basically, we took the COVID era and the COVID pandemic as an opportunity to highlight the fact that corporate flying and corporate and business travel could actually, in most cases, be replaced by conferencing, by phone calls, conference calls like the ones that we're having now. And so we wanted to use that opportunity to encourage corporates to actually secure the level of flying to secure reduced level of flying compared to previously before COVID hit.
All right, so this was kind of like a prediction or a case study to see, what could be the impact. And now, since this is already a couple of years in the past, can we quantify already the effect that this proposal had? Are there any results from that?
So we've seen quite a few companies starting to set targets to 50% of their 2019 levels, but we still see a lot of big corporate flyers that are failing to set targets and are continuing to increase their emissions. You can find on our Travel Smart campaign website, we have an emissions tracker. So you can see we selected, I think, around 300 different corporate flyers and corporates, companies, to try and address the level of flying and then measure their progress or their lack of progress to reaching, let's say, a target of reduced flying by 2025. So you could see, we have US companies, you have German companies, French companies, Swiss companies, a mix, let's say, of pharmaceutical, of tech companies, of manufacturing companies, that contribute to corporate flying and corporate flying emissions. So hopefully with this tracker, we're also aiming to raise awareness from also employees of the sectors, of the progress or lack of progress of their employers in reaching that target. But we fundamentally believe that they should be setting the example, and they should be the ones leading the way in trying to reduce energy demand from aviation from now until 2050.
So that's a very good example of you making an actual impact with the corporate travel and the respective tracker. Of course, another area that is very important are sustainable aviation fuels, or SAFs. But before we dive into those, let's focus very briefly on disruptive aircraft models or concepts. What promising concepts do you actually see, and what are their limitations?
So here we address also some of the internal contradictions that I face myself, because I do find it quite amazing that we could at one point have an fully zero emission aircraft that can fly over the Atlantic or could fly mostly across Europe. I do think that sort of innovation is worth promoting. The only issue is that what we're seeing concretely from the industry are maybe some disruptive aircraft models that have limited potential in terms of reducing CO2. You have, in terms of ranges, short to medium range might be covered by some electric, hybrid electric, or hydrogen aircraft. But we calculated in our own roadmap that with all of those technologies, if Airbus was to produce what they said that they would produce by 2035, a fully hydrogen-powered aircraft, we would only get 22 million tons of CO2 reduced, which is 8% of the baseline emission scenario that we calculated in our roadmap by 2050. If you move 5 years earlier, so if Airbus had some sort of mandate to create this aircraft 5 years earlier by 2030, we'd reach 23% of emission savings by 2050. So we, more than double the savings that we would get. And that's because of, the time that it takes to renew a fleet, for the fleet to enter the market. But if then we go to an entry into service, which is 5 years later, then we go down to only 1.8% of emission savings by 2050, because it's too late in that sense. If you enter the market in 2040 with a hydrogen aircraft, the time that it enters the fleet of certain airlines, you will see the benefits, or as much benefits from those aircraft by 2050. So I think what this data tries to show is that we need to be much more ambitious and much more aggressive in setting policies to deploy these disruptive aircraft models, because at the moment what we're seeing is some projects that are, developing different hybrid electric aircraft. I think 𝐥𝐢𝐤𝐤, Universal Hydrogen, 𝐸𝑎 as well, which is not hybrid electric, but actually hydrogen. And I think they're all promising solutions, but if you don't set in place regulations that actually incentivize that market to thrive or to scale up, we're never going to get enough, according to us, enough emission reduction to actually help the sector get to zero emission. There are discussions at the EU level around the Alliance for Zero Emission Aviation. We are a member of that alliance, trying to push ambition to go further, trying to put in place maybe incentives, policy mandates to try and make sure that there is a specific market for those zero emission planes to scale. Because one of the issues we're facing is that over the past 50 years, we've kind of let it up to the industry to find their own innovation. Most of the regulation, be it CO2 standard regulations that are set at ICAO, or maybe fuel efficiency improvements, they've all delivered very poor results in terms of the net, emissions of the sector. So I would say, in terms of whether I'm hopeful or not, I think one of the issues is the aircraft manufacturing industry today is so centered on a duopoly that doesn't really incentivize competition. I don't think that we'll see, a Tesla disruptor in aviation. I wish we could, because I think that it could have so much more potential. Direct use of electricity or direct use of hydrogen is much more efficient on paper than using, SAF, sustainable aviation fuels, that take a lot of energy and are quite inefficient to produce. So in an ideal world, we would set a framework that enables that market to thrive, but we're just very skeptical, seeing the current regulatory framework and seeing the kind of, let's say, slow pace of development of these technologies through these big players. We're a bit skeptical as to the actual potential of these models.
Well, I'm picking up the term that you've just thrown in, and that is SAF, as a very important part still. And when discussing SAFs, do you think it's accurate to simply refer to them as SAF? I mean, considering the significant variability in types of SAF, their actual sustainability, respectively, how would you break down the term SAF?
I think you ask a very good question there, because I think no one was really talking about SAF before maybe 2019. I think the term SAF has kind of evolved now and is used a bit as a blanket a term to put a lot of things in there. I think we need to set the record straight that not all SAFs are sustainable, and the aviation industry and the fuel industry has kind of coined this term. But from our side, we do see two different types of sustainable aviation fuels. So first one is biofuels. So obviously we all know about crop-based biofuels being actually sometimes a cure that's worse than the disease. It's sometimes even worse than the fossil fuel alternative because of all of the indirect effect of cultivating crops for biofuel uses. So the only type of biofuels that we think could potentially play a role in decarbonizing are advanced biofuels. So biofuels that are made from waste, from residues, from used cooking oil, from animal fats, municipal wastes. Obviously, it makes no sense to have waste and not maximize their use. But unfortunately, how much waste do we think we will be able to produce in the next 30 years to be able to decarbonize aviation? Our answer is very, very limited amounts of advanced biofuels can actually get to decarbonize aviation. I think in some of the roadmaps that we've seen, we get to maybe a maximum of 20% of aviation's energy demand by 2050, and that's really a maximum. So it's very limited in terms of supply, because supply of feedstock is actually capped. And there are also a lot of different issues related to biofuels, which is, first of all, fraud. A lot of the biofuels that we use, advanced biofuels that we use in Europe, are actually imported from different countries, a lot from Asia, from China. I think 80% of the used cooking oil that we import is actually imported from China. So how are we, verifying that the used cooking oil that we import from China is not actually disguised palm oil or is actually used? There are a lot of feedstock as well that are already used for other sectors. So, for example, pet food, chemicals, they're using waste oils for their own processes. So if that waste oil is now used for SAF, what is going to be used to replace that oil in those industries? So this is what we call competing uses. And that can sometimes lead to those sectors actually using poorer sustainable SAF, so actually less sustainable waste oils, sorry, not SAF. So basically, those are the first categories. You can sense that we're quite skeptical as to their potential to scale and their potential to actually answer aviation's decarbonization challenge. The second category is synthetic fuels, so e-fuels, synthetic kerosene, e-kerosene. There are a number of terms that we can use to qualify this type of fuel. But the main idea is to take renewable hydrogen and combine it with CO2, ideally captured from the atmosphere. So that produces a hydrocarbon that is like biofuels, can be dropped in current engines and current planes and be used without having to change a lot of the technicalities of how the aircraft works. So this is actually for us a more promising solution because it's quite scalable. Renewable electricity hopefully will scale up. We'll get to produce hydrogen. CO2, we have way too much of it in the atmosphere, so we absolutely need to capture it. So we have a sufficient amount of CO2 to be captured, and so we see that as more of a scalable, industrializable solution on the long run. And then the last, let's say, SAF or sustainable aviation fuel is obviously the direct use of hydrogen and electricity. But as I've said, we can maybe get to a certain level of use in some ranges, but they'll have limited potential in terms of scale and ranges of aircraft.
Right. And fortunately, you're not only pointing out, as an organization, you're not only pointing out what doesn't work, but you also provide guides, and one of the guides I'm thinking about here is this SAF sustainability guide for corporate buyers. You've already touched on many points probably that are mentioned in there, but what would be that one advice that you give to corporate buyers in the context of SAFs?
I think something that's interesting that we found out during this Travel Smart campaign is that a lot of corporate flyers are actually already trying to look for solutions to reduce their climate impact when it comes to flying. So that's why we produced this sustainability guide, because we wanted to raise awareness about some of the pitfalls of using different types of SAF and provide a bit of a counter narrative from some of the airlines or fuel providers that are selling these fuels to corporate companies. So I think ideally we do see the need to promote the e-fuel industry a bit further. So we do encourage as much as possible corporate buyers to sign at least offtake agreements or investment partnerships with e-fuel startups or e-fuel projects, because I think these are the kind of projects that need the most incentives to be scaled up. We also obviously encourage as much as possible corporate flyers to ask specifically what type of fuel is being sold to them. So where does the feedstock come from? Where was the fuel imported from or produced? Is it, what kind of feedstock are you using? Are they truly waste and residues? And then when it comes to e-fuels, making sure obviously that it's additional renewable hydrogen that is being used as a feedstock, and that ideally there is a CO2 captured from the air at one point in the plans of that project. I think one of the things that we're seeing as well in the deployment of sustainable aviation fuel, there are some barriers to the scale up of, let's say, more innovative fuels, because the fuel supply at the moment is controlled by a handful of fuel suppliers at different airports. And so it's very difficult sometimes to access sustainable fuel if the current jet fuel supplier at the airport doesn't plan on producing it or buying it or supplying it. And that's the issue that we're facing for e-fuel projects, because e-fuel projects are obviously a bit more nascent or a bit younger, but they are confronted to this barrier of entry of the market, which is held by big oil providers, the traditional ones, BP, Shell, Total, Exxon, Chevron. So I think we're encouraging as much as possible corporate flyers to enter in direct link with the e-fuel projects themselves, instead of passing through airlines or passing through jet fuel suppliers, traditional jet fuel suppliers, because we really need to overcome that barrier to make sure that in the end, the e-fuel projects scale up and start producing these fuels.
Those are all very tangible and really good advices that you've just mentioned here. And we have a lot of interesting talking points. I'm always surprised how much, time passes by in these interviews. But one publication that I stumbled across from June 2023, and I found it very relevant as well, is titled "Airbus, Show Us the Money." Now, we've already touched upon Airbus, but this is a slightly different angle. So Yeah, what is the update here? What is the takeaway from this publication?
I think the main objective of the publication was leading up to the Bourget Air Show. We were trying to put a bit more of an emphasis on the fact that most of the Bourget is fuel aircraft on the A320neos, on the successor of the A320neo, and we wanted to bring a bit more light and pressure to Airbus to show us actually what they're actually putting on the table to develop this hydrogen aircraft that they sold to us over a few years ago. So I think one of the main findings was, we did a few studies to try and quantify how much it would cost to develop a hydrogen aircraft, and I think we were around 15 billion of investment needed to develop this aircraft. So we went to the Bourget with that request and that question, which was Airbus, how much are you putting down to develop this hydrogen aircraft? Since then, we've seen worrying signs or signals that Airbus and Guillaume Faury are maybe downscaling a bit of their plans or objectives when it comes to developing this hydrogen aircraft, mentioning that there's not enough green hydrogen. They're maybe going to scale back on the actual ranges that they're considering to fly on hydrogen. And this is really difficult to hear because without those disruptive technologies, a lot of the plans that the industry itself is setting for itself will fail to reach fruition. So I think we hope, and at the end of the piece, we hope that when we come back to the Bourget next year, so in 2025, that maybe we'll see a bit more progress or we'll be a bit more confident. But unfortunately, the way that things are heading, we'll have to publish another piece, maybe stronger piece next year at the next Le Bourget show.
It clearly is another evidence that we also need institutions like yours that, do the unpleasant thing and apply pressure here and there. And another way to apply pressure would be to, show numbers. And for example, in the context of SAF, so e-fuels, you have this e-fuel tracker, right?
Yes.
And what I experienced in many of the conversations that I had was that, it is a long process from raising awareness. You mentioned 2019, as maybe a year where it changed a little bit more, but then towards getting a final investment decision, it is a long way. What are the challenges currently to get to those actual investment decisions to start building the infrastructure that we need?
I think that's a super important question that you're asking, because we do see in the tracking that we've done. So we've published an e-fuel tracker that listed at the start of 2024 around 45 pilot projects that are considering producing e-kerosene. And those 45 pilot projects, if they reach final investment decision and start producing, could actually very easily help the EU reach its SAF targets, its e-fuel mandates in 2030, 2035. But unfortunately, we are hearing from those producers that they're struggling to convince investors to, basically fund the deployment of their factories. And one of the main reasons is the potential lack of knowledge of the cost of hydrogen, the cost of the different types of CO2 that they can use to produce those fuels. But what is certain is that we have a mandate, and I think this is maybe a way to call out to the investment community and the financial community. There is a mandate within EU regulation that will oblige fuel suppliers to supply an amount of e-fuel in 2030, in 2032, in 2035. The kind of ramp up is clear. It's set in the legislation. So there is a demand. There will be a demand for those fuels. And so the kind of uncertainty of regulation cannot be used against e-fuel investment, because I think this is so important to remind people and to get out of this chicken and egg debate. We see airlines saying, "Oh, SAF is too expensive, it's never going to happen." And then we see fuel providers saying like, "Oh, well, airlines don't want to buy the SAF that we're going to produce because it's too expensive." I think we really need to get out of this chicken and egg debate. There is a mandate. We need to fill this mandate, not just for the industry, but as an economy as a whole, because this is also a way to drive growth and employment. But I think this is important to remind financial institutions specifically that there is less risk associated with investing in e-fuels because there is a legal mandate to reach that target. So hopefully that will help. And especially one of the things we hopefully will talk about as well, but on the lobbying side, we do see a lot of lobbying being done by the traditional fuel suppliers, the BPs, the Shells, the biofuel suppliers, to try and increase as much as they can the definition of sustainable feedstock to be able to continue to produce different types of biofuels that are actually not that sustainable, and hopefully shift away attention from e-fuel production, because that's not their core business, and they want to keep their core business as biofuel. So I think I really want to call out to not only the investment community, but also the big oil majors, the jet fuel, the traditional jet fuel suppliers, to actually do something about e-fuels and put money on the table to actually invest in e-fuels, because this is the only way to get to zero by 2050.
Yeah, so lobbying is something that you've mentioned. I mean, everyone has an agenda, everyone has to pursue certain objectives. And recently you published a press release that was also, around the topic of lobbying, but here in the context of non-CO2 effects. So what was it that you guys observed at TNE?
So on the non-CO2 topic, I think it's such an exciting topic. And I think it's great that your podcast is trying to unravel the different parts of non-CO2. And this is also an exciting opportunity because it's been so long since we've started knowing about non-CO2 effects. And it's only recently that regulators have started actually taking the issue a bit more seriously. So the European Green Deal finally addressed non-CO2. Still baby steps, but it's still a significant positive development. But there was a proposal to integrate non-CO2 potentially within the EU's carbon market, so the EU ETS. And one of the first measures that they started considering is trying to set up a monitoring, reporting, and verification scheme, an MRV, to try and, like we do for CO2, to try and monitor, to quantify, to calculate how much non-CO2 effects different flights can have and different airlines can have. And the scope of the measure was supposed to be, and is still supposed to be, for all flights coming and leaving the European territory. Now, what we saw is IATA, which represents, and you've had some of their representatives on your podcast. They've actually tried to influence decision makers to reduce the scope of the measure and to even reduce the ambition of the measure by making the scheme first voluntary and, if not two, at least only European. And we pushed back against that type of lobbying, not only because the decision was already legally approved a year ago. So, there's no backtracking. There shouldn't be any backtracking once the decision was made, because now it's just implementing this decision. And two, it's also environmentally backtracking, because what we see from current research is most of the warming happens on flights that are long-haul flights that are happening over the Atlantic or on the way to Asia. And so if you don't include those flights within the MRV, within the non-CO2 monitoring scheme, you're never going to be able to have sufficient data to be able to know where, how to avoid them potentially, or, what flights need to then use different types of fuel to make sure that they don't have a non-CO2 impact. So that's the issue that we have, is that we need to make sure that the non-CO2 monitoring is as ambitious and as wide as possible, because we understand this whole concept around non-CO2 being uncertain. There are some uncertainties around where the effects take place, or, how to mitigate them. But we know that non-CO2 is as important to deal with for the climate than CO2. And monitoring will at least provide a first step in helping policymakers to discuss how to legislate or regulate or mitigate those impacts. So I laugh when IATA says that, they want to improve scientific understanding and research, but they lobby against the only measure that would be put in place to actually help the science and help improve certainty. So fundamentally, we believe that the airline industry and IATA specifically, they don't want that regulation. They want to be left alone to deal with it voluntarily. But where has that gotten us for the past 25 years? We're still here struggling to try and improve scientific certainty around those effects. I remember in 2009, IATA saying that we would have 10% SAF in 2017. We're in 2023 and we have 0.2% SAF. So just to say, when we let the industry voluntarily deal with things, we actually don't achieve the same levels of ambition that if regulators actually come in and help. So I think this is a really exciting opportunity. I think the MRV will also provide a significant amount of data that can help the scientific community improve their understanding. And especially with AI involved at one point, who knows how we can integrate AI in future versions of the MRV. I mean, if we see Google getting involved in contrail mitigation, how can we not end up with a solution that enables aviation to avoid non-CO2 warming? I think there's a lot of potential, there's a lot of excitement, there are a lot of industries and partners that you have had on your podcast as well. So I just find it difficult to hear from airline representatives that they lobby against such measures, because those are the measures that are going to bring innovation and spur innovation and a market for those technologies.
Just to understand the weight of this press release, so what was the source for this claim to say that IATA is lobbying or airlines are lobbying?
So IATA sent a letter to the European Commission. The European Commission is the, let's say, body, the institution that is currently drafting this implementing regulation. So they sent a letter specifically to the Commission asking them to reduce the scope, to have the scheme voluntarily, because using scientific uncertainty as a reason not to move forward. We also have heard from different airlines that IATA has been sending their own members internationally letters to try and encourage their own governments. So, in the US, in maybe developing countries, in Asia, in South America, to try and encourage their governments to speak up and to fundamentally pressure European legislators to move back or backtrack on their measure. And so for us, that's unacceptable, because already it's been agreed, as I said, the legal scope was already agreed by co-legislators a few years ago. But it's also just not helping the scientific community, and the hypocrisy of having IATA saying that they're all committed to their net zero, committed to addressing non-CO2 effects, but then lobbying behind closed doors, trying to push policymakers to reduce the ambition of the measures is laughable. I think the main reason why airlines are avoiding this, because they're afraid of a price penalty to pay a price on their non-CO2 effects at one point. But the problem is that at the moment, we're not even there yet. We're only trying to monitor, improve scientific understanding of where these effects take place. Then we can discuss mitigation, and they'll have a way of and an input, there are always consultation processes when it comes to legislation in the future. So they will have a chance to input on what they think are the best ways to mitigate non-CO2, either by pricing, or either by contrail avoidance or incentives to avoid contrails, but we're not there yet. So I think that the way that they're reacting is prejudging what EU regulators are going to do or can do in the future to mitigate. And if you take that away, if it's just monitoring, I don't see what the problem is. But I think that they're afraid that at one point there will be, a non-CO2 tax or a non-CO2 price to be paid. But I think that's premature for the moment, because we still don't have sufficient data to be able to pinpoint where non-CO2 happens and to check that non-CO2 actually happens.
And taking all of these things into conclusion, and not only the scientific consensus right now, but also, the actual industry and how they behave. When do you think will there be a price tag on avoiding warming persistent contrails?
I think we're still a bit far from that, because as you highlighted, and some of the interviewees that you've had, highlight the fact that in some cases there is a really small fuel penalty. for avoiding contrails, which, I think also needs to be integrated in any pricing that you apply. You don't want to price non-CO2 effects and then actually increase CO2 emissions. I think that's really not what we, as an environmental organization, want to promote either. So I think when it comes to pricing, it needs to be really carefully designed. If ever it is to be put in place, it needs to be carefully designed to make sure that it actually incentivizes airlines to reduce their non-CO2 effects, and that they don't sort of contribute to increasing CO2 emissions. I think another venue that is quite interesting to look into is the actual fuel quality path for non-CO2 effects. So either you avoid the contrail through changes in your operational flight path, or you change the fuel that you burn in your aircraft by using, low sulfur, low aromatic fuel. And I think that's a pathway that hasn't been explored sufficiently, and I think definitely needs to be explored sufficiently, because without those two, let's say, mitigation pathways being fully developed and proven, I think pricing today would not incentivize their use. So I think we need to wait until the solutions are finally proven, or at least we have a better understanding of the impact of these solutions, so contrail mitigation and improved fuel quality, before trying to incentivize their use through any pricing mechanism.
And one key element in this tool chain of contrail management is the prediction of weather. And therefore, our next guest, or I should say our next guests, will be representing the German Weather Service, the DWD, or DWD in German. And it's the first time we have two guests on who are working on multiple projects in that domain. And that is Dr. Carmen Emmel and Dr. Björn Rüdiger Beckmann. I'm very much looking forward to hosting them. And now you have the chance to pass on a question to them.
Well, that's a great opportunity, because I think they're doing amazing work, and again, part of that exciting scientific community that can help improve our understanding of different ways of mitigating non-CO2. I think maybe one question would be, if they were, I understand they also will obviously speak to uncertainties and different things, but if they were a policymaker, what policies would they put in place to help move contrail mitigation or optimization of flights forward? What, in their view, would be key for policymakers to take to make sure that contrail mitigation happens?
That's a very good one. I'm sure they'll appreciate it. And I appreciate our conversation today, Jo. I really loved it, and you gave such dense answers, and I couldn't stop asking questions. Thank you very much for being part of this.
Thank you, Marius, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to have these discussions with you.
It was a pleasure from my side as well, and speak soon.